The moment I sat alone at the empty Christmas table, surrounded not by laughter and family, but by silence, I felt something inside me finally break. They hadn't even bothered to call. No explanation, no apology. I spent the holiday watching the clock, feeding myself false hope with every passing hour. But when they showed up a week later, not with belated greetings, but with desperate pleas for help, I was no longer the same woman. I was a woman who had learned the value of her time and of her love, and this time I had a lawyer and a plan. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Donovan, but everyone calls me Meg. I was 67 years old that December, a retired accountant living in Spokane, Washington. I had spent my life immersed in numbers, balancing books for small businesses and families alike, and I had been good at it, reliable, thorough, dependable. That was how people had always described me. Yet no amount of reliability or care had prepared me for the quiet devastation of that Christmas Eve. The morning of Christmas Eve had begun the way it always did, with a mix of anticipation and ritual. I woke early, long before the first light broke across the sky, and pulled the heavy curtains aside to find a pale layer of snow dusting the neighborhood. It was the kind of soft, undisturbed snow that promised a postcard-perfect holiday. I wrapped myself in my thick cardigan, the one Harold had given me on our 30th anniversary, and made my way to the kitchen where the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread still lingered from the night before. I had prepared for days. The turkey was thawing perfectly in the refrigerator. The cranberry sauce had been made from scratch, not from a can, just the way my daughter Caroline used to love it. There was a tray of sugar cookies shaped like stars and trees and bells, meticulously frosted in red and green icing. I had even pulled the old Christmas china from the back of the cupboard, wiping each plate and cup until they gleamed under the kitchen lights. I checked my phone multiple times throughout the morning, expecting updates, texts, voicemails, anything to confirm that my children and grandchildren were on their way, or that traffic was delaying them, or even just an emoji to say, thinking of you. But the phone remained silent, save for the occasional spam call or a promotional email wishing me happy holidays from a company I hadn't purchased from in years. Still, I refused to let doubt settle in. Families ran late, plans changed, but love remained steady. That was what I told myself as I set the table with 6 places. 1 for me, 2 for Caroline and her husband James, 2 for my teenage grandchildren Ethan and Maddie, and 1 extra just in case. I placed a tiny stocking at each setting, filled with little trinkets and chocolate Santas. I even arranged sprigs of holly in the center, thinking how nice it would look in the photos. I dressed carefully that afternoon, choosing a dark green sweater embroidered with a small gold star over the heart, a pair of black slacks, and the pearl earrings Harold had given me the Christmas before he passed away. I dabbed a little perfume on my wrists, a habit from another time when holidays meant company and laughter. I wanted to look my best, to show them they were coming home to someone who still cared, who still remembered. As the day wore on, the sky turned a deeper shade of blue, and the snow outside thickened, frosting the world in silence. I moved around the house, lighting candles, playing old Christmas records that popped and crackled on my vintage player. The house felt warm and inviting, filled with the smells of roasting turkey, baking bread, and sweet spices. At 4 o'clock, I began to worry. By 5, I was pacing lightly between the kitchen and the living room, peeking out the window every few minutes for headlights. At 6, I sat down at the table, the food laid out like an offering, steam curling into the air. By 7, I knew. They were not coming. No call, no text, no explanation. I sat at the head of the table, the only living soul in a room meant for celebration, staring at the candles flickering weakly against the growing darkness. I watched the wax melt and pool at the base, drip by drip, as if the house itself were weeping. I ate a small slice of turkey to keep up appearances, cutting it into neat pieces that I barely tasted. I forced a sip of wine, feeling it burn down my throat in a way that had nothing to do with alcohol. Afterward, I packed away the food methodically, wrapping platters in foil, stacking plates in the sink to be washed later. I didn't cry. I told myself there would be time for that later, if I needed it. Instead, I returned to the living room, curled up on the couch beneath Harold's old Afghan, and stared at the twinkling lights on the tree. Memories crowded my mind like uninvited guests. Harold hoisting a young Caroline onto his shoulders to place the star atop the tree. Thomas sneaking cookies from the kitchen counter when he thought I wasn't looking. Maddie, barely 5, belting out Christmas carols with unrestrained joy. Ethan's laughter as he tore open a model train set one snowy morning. They were all echoes now, shadows dancing against the walls. Sometime around midnight, my phone buzzed. For a breathless moment, hope flared so brightly in my chest that it almost hurt. It was a mass text from Carolyn. "Merry Christmas, everyone," with a picture of their family smiling by another tree. One not in my house. They hadn't forgotten Christmas. They had just chosen to spend it without me. I sat there, staring at the screen, until the image blurred through the tears I hadn't meant to shed. I turned off the phone and set it face down on the coffee table. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the driveways, the roads, and the dreams I had so carefully built for this day. I realized then that it wasn't anger that filled me. It was clarity. They had drawn their lines. And now, for the first time in my life, I would draw mine. Tomorrow would not find me sitting at this same table, hoping for crumbs of affection. Tomorrow, I would begin to reclaim the life I had given so freely to people who no longer saw its value. Before tonight, I allowed myself to sit quietly in the presence of my own company. I was not lonely. I was simply alone. And that was something I could learn to live with. The morning after Christmas arrived with a brutal honesty that I could not escape. There were no presents to open, no joyful shouts from children, no smells of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. The only sounds were the mechanical hum of the heater kicking on and the soft groan of the old house settling into another cold winter day. I moved slowly through the house, my body stiff from a night spent curled on the couch, still wearing the green sweater and pearl earrings I had donned with such foolish hope the day before. I made myself a pot of coffee out of habit more than desire. The bitterness of the brew filled the kitchen as I stood there, staring out at the snow-blanketed yard. My breath fogged the window pane as I leaned closer, tracing invisible patterns with my fingertip. The world outside looked untouched, perfect even, but inside the house and inside my heart, there was only hollow emptiness. I wandered into the living room and sat down at the small secretary desk that Harold had given me on our 25th wedding anniversary. It had been gathering dust for years, crowded by newer furniture and forgotten in the rush of daily life. Now, in the quiet aftermath of disappointment, it beckoned to me like an old friend. I pulled open the top drawer and found it just as I had left it, a neat stack of envelopes tied together with a red ribbon, birthday cards, holiday greetings, handwritten notes from years gone by. I untied the ribbon with shaking fingers and began to sort through them. There were cards from Caroline, bright and colorful, filled with promises to visit soon, apologies for being so busy, declarations of love signed with a flourish. There were letters from Thomas, always shorter, more practical, but no less affectionate in their clipped phrases. "Thanks for everything, Mom. Couldn't have done it without you. I found crayon drawings from Maddie and Ethan when they were small, the stick figures always smiling, always with exaggerated hearts drawn over their heads. Each piece of paper felt heavier than the last, weighted with memories that now tasted sour on my tongue. Promises, so many promises, to visit more often, to call every Sunday, to come spend holidays together, just like old times. They had meant them once, I was sure of that, but time had eroded those promises like wind wears down stone, slowly, imperceptibly, until only a vague memory remains. I sifted deeper into the drawer and found a manila envelope labeled House Documents. Inside were copies of the loan I had co-signed for Caroline and James when they bought their second home. Another folder held the promissory note from Thomas, dated 7 years back, when he had started his first business venture and needed seed money to get off the ground. I remembered the meetings with the bank, the rush of pride I had felt helping my children take bold steps into their futures. I had done it willingly, without hesitation, because that is what mothers do. They give even when no one asks. They hope even when there is no guarantee. They believe even when doubt creeps in. I sat back in the chair, holding the documents loosely in my lap, and felt a strange detachment settle over me. It was as if I was reading the story of another woman's life, someone who had given everything and had been left with nothing but scraps of old paper and broken assurances. The kettle whistled in the kitchen, sharp and shrill, pulling me out of my thoughts. I rose and made myself another cup of coffee, though the first had barely been touched. The ritual of it comforted me, a reminder that some things could still be controlled, even if the bigger pieces of my life had slipped beyond my grasp. I sat at the kitchen table with my mug and stared at the now wilting poinsettia centerpiece. Its bright red leaves were beginning to curl at the edges, the vibrancy fading hour by hour. I thought about the last conversation I had with Caroline in November. She had promised they would come for Christmas, promised it would be just like when we were kids, Mom. You'll see. And I had believed her, just like I had believed Thomas when he said he would pay me back in a year, maybe 2 at the most. Just like I had believed James when he assured me they would visit every month once the new baby came. Just like I had believed them all when they said I would never be alone. But promises, I realized, are easy in the saying and hard in the keeping. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the eaves and sending flurries of snow dancing across the street. I watched as the gusts battered the carefully built snowbanks, reshaping them without mercy, wiping away the careful work of hands and shovels as if it had never existed at all. It was a fitting metaphor. I had built my life around them, laid down my love and my sacrifices brick by brick, believing it would create something permanent, something unshakable. But in the end, it had been as fragile as snowdrifts under a winter wind. By mid-morning, I packed the Christmas decorations away. I wrapped the ornaments carefully in tissue paper, placed them into their bins, stripped the tree bare, and wrestled it back into its box. I vacuumed up the fallen needles, wiped down the shelves where garlands had hung. Every action felt like an exorcism, a way to reclaim the space that had been saturated with so much unmet hope. When I finished, I stood in the center of the empty living room and took a deep breath. It was time to stop mourning promises that had been scattered like ashes to the wind. It was time to start making promises to myself. Small ones, perhaps, simple ones, but promises I intended to keep. It was the last Friday of December, the air outside brittle and sharp with cold, the kind of cold that seeped into the walls and settled deep into your bones no matter how high you turned up the heat. I had spent the morning rearranging my bookshelves, something I hadn't done in years. There was a strange comfort in handling the old hardcovers, dusting each spine, and finding small forgotten notes tucked between the pages. A recipe in my handwriting, a shopping list from a decade ago, a pressed flower that crumbled the moment I touched it. I was halfway through alphabetizing the mystery novels when I heard a knock at the door. It startled me. No one visited without calling anymore, not in this world of text messages and social media updates. I wiped my hands on my jeans and moved toward the door, peeking through the narrow sidelight window. Standing there, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, was my son, Thomas. His wife, Christina, stood slightly behind him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression guarded. For a brief, foolish second, my heart lifted. Maybe they had come to apologize. Maybe they had realized what they had done and wanted to make amends. Maybe Christmas had weighed on their consciences more than they had let on. I unlocked the door and opened it slowly, the winter air rushing past me into the warm hallway. Thomas smiled, but it was a thin, nervous smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice too loud, too bright. "Thomas." "Christina," I said, stepping aside to let them in. They entered hesitantly, like guests, unsure of their welcome, their eyes darting around the living room as if assessing the changes since their last visit. Christina's gaze lingered on the empty space where the Christmas tree had stood just days before, her mouth tightening slightly before she turned her attention back to her husband. We stood there in an awkward triangle, the silence thick enough to touch. "Can we sit down?" Thomas asked finally. I nodded and led them to the living room, settling into my usual armchair while they perched together on the couch, close but not touching. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands rubbing together as if he could warm himself by friction alone. "I'm sorry to drop in like this," he began, and I could hear the rehearsed cadence in his voice. "We wouldn't bother you if it wasn't important." I waited. He shifted again, glancing at Christina, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. "The thing is," he continued, "I'm in a bit of trouble." "We're in trouble." Christina's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. I stayed silent, letting the weight of their own words settle between us. Thomas took a deep breath. "You know the business I started a few years back, the landscaping company?" Of course I knew. I had helped him with the initial investment, liquidating part of my retirement savings so he could buy equipment and hire a crew. I had signed the papers without hesitation, trusting in his dreams the way only a mother could. "Things have been rough," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We hit some financial snags, made some expansions that didn't pan out, and now—" He paused, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "Now there's a lawsuit." Christina shifted uncomfortably beside him, avoiding my gaze. I waited, still saying nothing. "A client is suing us for breach of contract," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if saying it quietly would lessen the blow. "And if we lose, we could lose everything. The house, the business, everything." I let the words hang in the air. Not once had he mentioned Christmas. Not once had he asked how I was, whether I had been alone, whether I had been hurt. He was here because he needed something, not because he missed me. Not because he regretted leaving me alone at the holiday table, because I was a resource, a means to an end. "We need a lawyer," Christina said, breaking her silence. Her voice was brittle, impatient. "A good one, and we can't afford the kind of retainer they're asking for. Not without help." The word help landed between us like a stone in a still pond. They were asking me for money. Again, I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the roughness of my own skin, the veins standing out more sharply these days. "How much do you need?" I asked, my voice so calm it startled even me. Thomas brightened, mistaking my composure for willingness. "About 20,000 to start, maybe more if it goes to trial." Christina leaned forward, her manicured nails tapping anxiously against her coffee mug. "It's just temporary," she added quickly. "We'll pay you back. We swear. It's just, we're out of options." I thought about the loan documents still tucked in my desk drawer, about the promises made and broken like brittle twigs underfoot, about the silent Christmas, the empty table, the unopened gifts. I thought about the decades I had spent putting everyone else's needs before my own. I rose slowly from my chair. Thomas and Christina straightened, expectant, hopeful. "I need some time to think," I said simply. Their faces fell, but they masked it quickly behind tight, polite smiles. "Of course," Thomas said, standing awkwardly. "Of course, Mom. We understand." Christina rose too, smoothing her coat with quick, agitated movements. "We just hope you'll think fast," she said, her voice clipped. "There's a deadline for filing responses." I nodded, but said nothing more. They shuffled to the door, murmured quick goodbyes, and disappeared back into the cold. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a long moment, the cold wood pressing into my back. This time, I would not rush to save them. This time, I would think. This time, I would choose myself. After they left, I stood motionless for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The house was silent again, but it was not the soft, peaceful silence I had learned to welcome. It was the heavy, oppressive kind that wrapped around my shoulders like a wet, suffocating blanket. I finally pushed myself away from the door and wandered back into the living room, unsure of what to do with myself. I sank into the old armchair, the same one Harold used to claim every evening with a book in one hand and a glass of iced tea in the other. I closed my eyes and let the memories of him wash over me, small flashes of a life that felt impossibly far away. Harold, who had always told me that love was about showing up, even when it was hard. Harold, who had been there for every milestone, every stumble, every Christmas morning, never once making me feel like a burden. The betrayal of my children stung deeper because it stood in such stark contrast to the life Harold and I had built together. Love had always been an action to me, not a sentiment. It had been nights spent nursing sick children, mornings spent packing lunches while running late for work, weekends surrendered to soccer games and piano recitals. It had been saving for college instead of taking vacations, covering emergencies they never even knew about, standing in the shadows so they could shine in the spotlight. I had believed, naively perhaps, that that kind of love would be repaid in kind someday. I reached for the old ledger I kept tucked under the coffee table, the one where I tracked my personal finances with the same precision I had once offered to my clients. I flipped through the pages, tracing the careful, neat handwriting that documented every dollar lent, every expense covered, every sacrifice made in the name of family. The numbers stared back at me like silent accusations. The down payment for Caroline and James's first house. The car repairs for Thomas when he couldn't afford them. The medical bills for little Ethan when Christina's insurance had lapsed. I had paid and paid and paid, and not once had I kept score in my heart. But the ledger told a different story, one I could no longer ignore. I closed the book and set it on my lap, running my hand over the worn leather cover. I felt a strange mix of grief and anger rising in my chest, not because I regretted helping them. I had done it willingly, out of love, out of a sense of duty that felt as natural to me as breathing, but because they had come to see my love not as a gift, but as an obligation. They had come to believe that no matter how much they took, I would always be there to give more. I leaned my head back against the chair and stared at the ceiling, the old wooden beams dark against the white paint. Somewhere along the way, the meaning of love had been lost, twisted into something transactional and hollow. I thought about Thomas and Christina sitting on my couch, their faces tight with worry, their voices dripping with urgency. They hadn't come to reconnect. They hadn't come to offer apologies. They had come because they needed another withdrawal from the bank of my life. The realization hit me harder than I expected. Love should never be measured in dollars and cents. But here I was, holding a ledger that said otherwise. I rose from the chair and walked to the window, staring out at the street below. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, settling on the branches of the oak tree in my front yard. The world looked so peaceful from inside, so still. Yet I knew that under the perfect white layer, life was messy, complicated, and often cruel. I turned away from the window and walked back to the secretary desk. I pulled out a sheet of paper and uncapped my pen. My hand hovered over the page for a long moment before I began to write, the words coming more easily than I had anticipated. I wrote out everything, the loans, the payments, the promises made and broken. I wrote about the Christmas Eve I had spent alone, the empty chairs, the untouched food growing cold. I wrote about the knock at my door and the hollow desperation in their voices. And then, at the bottom of the page, I wrote a simple truth I had never dared admit before. Love does not mean erasing yourself for others. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the ledger, tucking it among the years of records like a final entry in a long, exhausting account. It was time to close this chapter, not with bitterness, not with vengeance, but with a clear-eyed understanding that loving someone did not require sacrificing yourself at every turn. I deserved better, not because I had given everything, but because I existed. I was not just a mother, a grandmother, a convenient solution to their problems. I was a woman who had earned the right to live the rest of her life without being drained dry by those she loved most. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the living room floor. I gathered the ledger, the loose papers, the remnants of years spent pouring myself out for others, and placed them gently into a box. I sealed it with a strip of tape and carried it into the guest bedroom, setting it high on a shelf where I wouldn't see it every day. It was still part of my story, but it would no longer dictate the ending. I returned to the living room and stood there, letting the silence settle around me like a protective cloak. Thomas and Christina would come back soon, expecting answers, expecting help, expecting me to be the same woman they had always known. But I wasn't, not anymore. And the next time they asked for a price, they would find that I had finally learned how to say no. The next morning, the decision settled into me like a second skin. It wasn't dramatic or fiery the way I had always imagined standing up for myself might feel. It was quieter, heavier, something closer to inevitability than triumph. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black and strong, and sat at the kitchen table, the early sunlight slicing across the room in thin, sharp beams. It lit up the corners of the house I had neglected, the dust on the windowsill, the fraying edges of the old rug. Life, after all, had gone on even when I wasn't looking closely enough. I opened the old planner I kept by the fridge, flipping past birthdays and anniversaries, the notes I had scribbled down as reminders to call, to visit, to send a card. I found a clean page, drew a straight line across the top, and wrote 2 words in large, deliberate letters: New rules. The first rule was simple: no more unconditional giving. I thought about how many times over the years I had said yes automatically, how many times I had dug into my savings, canceled my plans, postponed my dreams to make someone else's easier. I thought about the missed vacations, the postponed house repairs, the quiet little sacrifices that had built up into something massive and invisible, like layers of dust settling over a forgotten piece of furniture. The second rule, love would no longer be confused with obligation. I loved Thomas. I loved Caroline. I loved my grandchildren. That was not going to change. But love did not mean forfeiting my dignity. Love did not mean being a wallet they could open when things got rough, only to be shut and forgotten again when they no longer needed what I could give. The third rule, my peace would come first. It sounded selfish even as I wrote it, but I let the words stay. I was tired of waiting for scraps of attention, tired of molding myself to fit into their busy lives. I deserved mornings spent lingering over coffee, afternoons wandering bookstores, evenings laughing with friends who called because they wanted to, not because they needed something. I closed the planner and placed it firmly back on the counter. The new rules were written, but they would mean nothing if I didn't enforce them. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. It was a message from Thomas. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. Have you thought about it? We really could use your help. Love you." The words sat on the screen, glowing faintly, as if daring me to respond the way I always had, with hesitation, with guilt, with that aching hope that this time would be different. But something inside me had shifted. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took a shower, letting the hot water pound against my back, washing away some invisible residue of all the times I had said yes against my better judgment. I got dressed slowly, choosing a soft sweater and comfortable jeans. Nothing fancy, just clothes that felt like me. Then I grabbed my purse and headed out the door. I drove to the law offices of Parker and Smith, a small firm tucked between a bakery and an antique shop downtown. I had looked them up the night before, reading reviews and making sure they specialized in estate planning and family law. The receptionist, a kind woman named Sandra, greeted me with a smile and handed me a clipboard of forms. I filled them out steadily, my hands surprisingly steady as I detailed my information. When the young attorney, a woman not much older than Caroline, called me into her office, I explained everything in calm, measured tones. The business loans, the co-signed mortgages, the lack of repayment, the recent request for legal fees. She listened without judgment, nodding and taking notes. When I finished, she smiled warmly and said, "You have more power than you realize, Mrs. Donovan. Let's make sure you're protected." We spent the next 2 hours drafting documents that would change everything. An agreement stating that any future financial help would come in the form of formal loans, with interest and repayment schedules. A revision to my will, removing automatic inheritances until specific conditions were met. Clear, enforceable boundaries that were no longer suggestions but requirements. As I signed the papers, I felt something unfurl inside me, something long dormant. It wasn't anger, it wasn't bitterness, it was resolve. I had given them so much out of love. Now, if they wanted my help, they would have to earn it with respect. When I returned home, the house felt different, lighter, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had reclaimed it, not the structure, but the space it held inside me. My phone buzzed again that evening. Another message from Thomas, shorter this time. "Really need to know, Mom. It's urgent." I sat down at the kitchen table, my planner open beside me. The words, "new rules," staring back at me. I typed out a response, slow and deliberate. "Thomas, I have made some decisions about how I will be handling financial matters going forward. If you and Christina are serious about needing assistance, I will need you to review a formal agreement with your lawyer. I'm happy to email it to you. Let me know. I hit send before I could second guess myself. The silence that followed was loud, but it didn't hurt the way it once would have. It felt clean. It felt right. I closed my phone and poured myself a glass of wine, toasting quietly to the woman who had finally learned that loving her family didn't mean losing herself in the process. The new rules were in place, and this time they were here to stay. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I went about my routines with the same deliberate calm: coffee in the morning, a short walk when the weather allowed, reading in the afternoons, and crosswords at night. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. It was as if I were seeing everything with new eyes. Not just the rooms in my home, but the layers of my life that I had ignored for too long. One morning, while reorganizing a drawer in the hallway, I came across an old photo album. It had been tucked away for years, beneath instruction manuals and extension cords and things I no longer had use for. The edges were frayed, the cover cracked slightly, but the photos inside were intact, frozen moments in glossy rectangles. There were images of Thomas as a boy, missing his two front teeth and grinning with watermelon juice on his chin. Caroline holding a kitten she had begged to keep. Harold standing behind the grill in a ridiculous apron, flipping burgers and laughing with his whole face. Page after page, I watched time unravel. Birthday parties with crepe paper and homemade cakes. Camping trips with rickety tents and burnt marshmallows. Vacations where we couldn't afford resorts, so we made do with lakes and packed lunches. I had forgotten how many times I had been the one behind the camera, capturing joy that I never got to be in. There was a photograph of Christmas morning from years ago, maybe 1992. Thomas sitting cross-legged in pajamas. Caroline next to him, unwrapping a box the size of her whole lap. My handwriting on the gift tag was just barely visible. To my sweet girl with all my heart. I stared at that picture for a long time. I remembered saving for months to buy them the things they had wanted that year. I had gone without new shoes, so Caroline could have that keyboard, so Thomas could have the bike. It had never felt like a sacrifice then. It had felt like love. But now, staring down at those frozen smiles, I wondered where the shift had occurred. When had giving turned into expectation? When had my love stopped being something treasured and started becoming something required? Later that afternoon, I sat down with a notepad and wrote out everything I had ever given them. Not the financials, that list already lived in my planner, but the intangibles, the sleepless nights, the job I passed on so I could be home in the evenings, the friendships I let fade because they didn't fit neatly around playdates and parent-teacher meetings, the retirement I delayed when Harold got sick, and the part-time consulting I took on afterward, just so I could help Thomas with his business loan. The list grew and grew until the lines blurred on the page and my hand cramped from writing. I sat back, staring at the black ink scrawled across the paper, stunned by its sheer weight. These were the things I had never said out loud. These were the things I had kept tucked into the quiet corners of my heart, convinced that speaking them would somehow diminish them, that love should never be tallied, that a mother gives without counting. But maybe that was part of the problem, because by not naming these things, by not honoring them, I had allowed everyone, including myself, to believe they didn't matter. That night, I had a dream about Harold. He was standing in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove, wearing that same ridiculous apron. He turned to me and said nothing, just smiled the way he used to when he wanted me to know he was proud. I woke up with tears on my cheeks and a strange sense of peace in my chest. It was time to stop hiding the truth from myself. The next day, I printed copies of the documents my lawyer had helped me draft. I placed them in a manila envelope and set it by the door. If Thomas asked again, I would hand it to him. If he didn't, I would move on. In the meantime, I reached out to an old friend from church, Susan, someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. We met for lunch at a small cafe downtown, and I found myself laughing in a way I hadn't in a long time. Loud, unfiltered, real. I told her a little about what had happened, and she listened without judgment, only placing her hand gently over mine and nodding with quiet understanding. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. And she was right. So many women our age had similar stories of being forgotten, sidelined, taken for granted. We had built families and homes and identities on the backs of service and love. And when the world no longer needed us in those ways, it didn't know what to do with us. But we knew. We could rewrite the rules. We could find joy again. Not through their validation, but through our own choices. By the end of the week, I had made a list of things I wanted to do for myself. I wanted to take a ceramics class at the community center. I wanted to visit Portland in the spring, just to wander the gardens and smell the blooming roses. I wanted to plant sunflowers in the backyard, even though the neighbors might complain they were too tall. These were not grand ambitions, but they were mine. And for the first time in decades, I had given myself permission to chase them without guilt. I no longer needed to be needed. I needed to be whole. That was the revelation. It hadn't come with a dramatic confrontation or a final argument. It had come in the quiet, in the stillness, in the moments I allowed myself to stop performing the role of the forever giving mother and finally step into the fullness of being a woman with a voice, with boundaries, with a life still ahead of her, not behind. Ahead. I hadn't heard from Thomas in nearly a week. After I sent that message about the formal agreement, the one outlining the terms and conditions of any further help, the silence that followed was almost deafening. At first, I checked my phone constantly, half expecting a response driven by anger, confusion, maybe even regret. But nothing came. No follow-up call, no email. Just a blank space where his voice used to live. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. There was a part of me, an old part, deep in the marrow of motherhood, that still longed to be needed, to be consulted, to be loved unconditionally by the children I had poured so much of myself into. But that part of me was growing quieter with each passing day. Not dead, just less powerful. Like a song that used to be my favorite, but no longer brought the same emotions when I heard it. Instead of waiting, I moved forward. I went to the community center on a Tuesday morning and signed up for the ceramics class. The instructor, a gentle woman named April, wore her silver hair in a long braid down her back and spoke softly, like someone who had spent most of her life listening rather than talking. The class was filled with other women like me, some widowed, some divorced, some simply tired of being invisible. We laughed more than we talked. We made terrible mugs and lopsided bowls and clumsy vases, and we encouraged each other like we were sculpting masterpieces. Every misshapen piece of clay was celebrated because it was ours, shaped by our hands, not for anyone else, not to impress, just to create. I began to notice the small joys I had missed while I was wrapped in guilt and obligation. The way the sun warmed the hardwood floors in the living room mid-afternoon. The way my neighbor's dog barked rhythmically at the mail truck every single day, never failing. The scent of fresh oranges at the market, their skins cold and dimpled under my fingers. I hadn't realized how numb I had become until my senses began to wake up again. One afternoon, I ran into Caroline at the grocery store. It was a strange encounter, unplanned and a bit awkward. She was pushing a cart full of snacks and juice boxes, her eyes tired, her shoulders tight. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. We exchanged polite words. How are you? How are the kids? How's the house? But it was surface level, cautious. She didn't bring up Christmas. I didn't bring up the silence that had followed. It was like we were both walking on a glass floor we were afraid to crack. She mentioned something about being busy, about things being complicated lately, and I nodded, offering understanding without making space for excuses. When she asked if I wanted to come over sometime soon, I smiled gently and told her I'd think about it. I didn't owe her a yes. Not anymore. That shift felt powerful. Back at home, I went through the closet in the guest bedroom. There were still toys from when the grandkids were younger, board games missing pieces, old puzzles half assembled in boxes. I didn't throw them away. I wasn't erasing anyone. But I packed them neatly into bins, labeled them, and stored them in the garage. The room looked larger afterward. Lighter, more mine. That night, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it by the fireplace. The house was quiet, but not lonely. I had always feared this kind of silence before, as if it would swallow me whole. But now I saw it differently. It wasn't a punishment, it was a choice, a space I had created and claimed. The next morning, I received a voicemail from Thomas. His voice was subdued, even a little hesitant. He said he got my message, that he understood the new arrangement. He didn't say thank you. He didn't apologize. He simply said they were figuring things out and that they'd be in touch. I listened to the message twice, waiting for the feeling it would stir, but there was nothing sharp or bitter. Just a quiet confirmation that the road between us had changed. We were no longer on the same path. Maybe someday our roads would meet again, in a new way, with fresh intentions. But for now, I had turned off the main highway of their expectations and chosen a smaller, quieter road of my own. I started waking up earlier, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to see the sun rise over the hills beyond my backyard. I started writing again, not for anyone else, just short little reflections in a notebook I kept by the bedside. Thoughts about aging, about forgiveness, about the weight and warmth of starting over. I began to understand that my story wasn't ending. It was just changing genres. I didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I was the one behind the wheel. New Year's Eve arrived with none of the fanfare I used to associate with it. No streamers, no clinking glasses at midnight, no crowding around the TV to watch the countdown in Times Square. Instead, the night moved in quietly, soft and unassuming, as snow began to fall outside my window. I stood in the kitchen, peeling apples for a pie, the rhythm of the blade against the fruit oddly meditative. The house smelled of cinnamon and cloves, and for the first time in years, I wasn't making dessert for anyone but myself. I didn't mind the solitude, not anymore. After dinner, I bundled up in a thick coat and scarf and stepped out onto the porch with a cup of hot tea cradled between my hands. The street was silent, the snow muffling every sound into something sacred. I could hear the faint crackle of distant fireworks, early celebrations echoing across town, but here, on my own steps, everything was still. The lamplight cast golden halos onto the white ground, and I stood there breathing it in. The cold, the quiet, the moment. As midnight approached, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't call anyone. I lit a single candle on the kitchen table and sat down in front of it with my notebook. The same one I had started just a few weeks earlier, filled now with pages of unspoken thoughts and hard truths I had finally found the courage to face. I wrote the date at the top of the page, January 1st, and paused before writing anything else. There was no need for a resolution. I didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep. What I needed wasn't more pressure to change who I was. What I needed was permission to continue, to build on what had begun quietly and painfully and honestly. I wrote, "This year I will live for myself without guilt." Then I closed the notebook and blew out the candle. New Year's Day greeted me with a pale sky and a thin crust of frost over everything. I made breakfast slowly, scrambled eggs, toast with jam, and a small glass of orange juice. I played music while I cleaned the kitchen, something light and jazzy, and let myself hum along. It felt good to move without hurry, to not brace for anyone else's schedule. Later in the day, I drove to the park. The roads were mostly clear, the snow packed down by cautious tires. I parked near the trailhead and started walking, my boots crunching softly with every step. I passed families taking photos, couples holding hands, and children bundled up like colorful marshmallows racing to catch snowflakes. I watched them without envy. I didn't feel like I was missing anything. I felt like a quiet observer of a world I had once revolved around, but no longer did. Near the lake, I sat on a bench and watched the ducks huddle together in the thin sliver of unfrozen water. I pulled a thermos of tea from my bag and sipped slowly, the warmth grounding me. A woman walking her dog passed and offered a smile. I returned it, grateful for the simplicity of the exchange. On the way home, I stopped at a small local bookstore I had passed 100 times but never entered. Inside, the owner, a man in his 70s with a sweater vest and gentle eyes, greeted me like an old friend. We chatted about mystery novels and poetry, and I left with 2 paperbacks and an invitation to the shop's next reading night. I hadn't felt that kind of spark in years, the kind that whispered, "You still belong somewhere." Back home, I rearranged the furniture in the guest room, transforming it into a space that reflected who I was now. I moved a small writing desk under the window, placed a reading lamp on the corner, and filled the bookshelves with titles that had once brought me joy. I hung a painting of the ocean I had bought at a craft fair years ago, but never framed. The room, once set aside for others, had finally become mine. That night, I curled up in bed with one of the books I had bought, a cup of cocoa in hand, and a cat curled against my legs. I read until the words blurred and the warmth of the blankets pulled me under. No one called, no one texted, and still, I felt full. This was not the life I had envisioned for myself when I was younger. It wasn't the life I thought I would have when I was raising children or building traditions or carving out space for everyone else. But it was mine, and in many ways, it was better, because now I chose everything in it. I chose quiet mornings and unhurried evenings. I chose honesty over obligation. I chose love that didn't ask me to disappear. And most of all, I chose myself, not as a reaction to what had been taken from me, but as a promise of what I would no longer give away so freely. The year stretched out ahead like a road I had never traveled, open and winding and full of possibility, and I was finally ready to walk it, alone, unafraid, and free.